Welcome to Healing and Made Free with Janet Boynes Ministries. Thank you for listening. Janet will be talking about her struggle with addiction, alcohol, drugs, eating disorders, unwanted same-sex attraction, and living a homosexual life. Janet has survived all those things by the grace of God. Janet's not a doctor, she's not a therapist, she's not a psychotherapist, she's not a licensed counselor. Janet is an ordained pastor and wants to show you God's promises, how God has set her free, and how you can be set free. What He has done for her, He will do it for you. If healing and freedom are what you want, you have come to the right place at the right time. Let's get started. Here is Janet Boynes.
This story that we're about to talk about today is near and dear to my heart because many of you know that read my first book called Out, that I was raised in a family of 7 kids, 4 different fathers. Pastor Rod happened to come to our church. He's good friends with my pastor. Give a shout out to Darren Strout at Foundations Church here in Texas. And your story, Pastor Rod, impacted me so much. I knew that I had to get you on my podcast. So welcome to Healing and Made Free with Janet Boynes.
Well, thanks, Janet. It's a pleasure to be here today and pleasure to meet you at Foundations Church a couple weeks ago. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an honor. And again, thank you for being here because my listeners are hearing so many different stories on people who God has healed and set free. And we all have a story, but I believe this particular story will impact my listeners, those that are watching on YouTube or watching on any, podcast platform. Pastor Rod, I want to start off with talking about how you grew up and your background on having multiple dads.
Yeah. And Janet, first of all, feel free to call me Rod.
Okay.
I appreciate that. But so, there's a lot to the story. I wrote a book about it, but just a quick little overview. Back in the summer of 1961, there was a couple dating. They knew a man and a woman who didn't know each other. So they said, you know what, I think they'd be great on a date. So they sent him up on a blind date. And the dad or the guy made a bet with the person, the guy, and he said, I'll bet $5 that before the night's over, I can have sex with this woman you've set me up with. He won the bet, and 9 months later, I was born. And so the story that my mom tells me is that he left right after she was 19 years old and single and pregnant. And back in 1961, it's not like it is today. It was a lot different. So having said that, I never had met my dad, never knew anything about him. Like when you go to the doctor and they say, do you have any history of this on your father's side? I'm like, I have no idea. I don't know anything. I knew his name, Rodney Mell. Quickly, then shortly thereafter, my mom got married, had my brother. Got divorced. After that, my mom got married again, had my 2 sisters, got divorced, and then got married again. So growing up, kind of 4 different fathers, revolving door, so to speak. All of them were military. So we were moving around a lot because of military transfers or because of running from a dad or running toward a dad. So being the oldest, I was the one stability factor for my mom in that whole thing. And as a result of that, I learned some things we can get into later on that. But that's basically how I grew up, is seeing different men enter the house and not sure if I call them dad or their first name, or do I just say, hey, you, or whatever. My first dad abandoned me. My second dad later in life was, he was undercover narcotics agent. And somebody found out about that. A gang member killed him. Third dad, alcoholic, abusive, would not towards me or to the other brother or sisters, but toward my mom. And we would see that happen in the house. And then my fourth dad walked in one day from outside and saw him with the neighbor lady from across the street in bed. So just a lot of different things that a little kid should not see. So that's a quick synopsis of what that was like growing up.
That can be really confusing to a child when they see, these men coming in and out of the house. You grew up with multiple dads, but in my family, I was raised in a family of 7 kids, 4 different fathers. My oldest brother had a dad, and then the two under him had the same dad, and that was the man my mom married. And then she had sex out of wedlock with somebody else's husband, and I was born. Then three under me have the same dad. And I didn't find out who my dad was until I was 13. How did you find out that the men that were coming in and out of your house was not your biological father?
Yeah. So, for years, my mom told me that my dad and her were married. And it wasn't until later that I found out that they weren't married and that it was kind of a one night thing. And I think, I think part of the reason she did that was just to kind of protect me and thinking that I had a real dad, so to speak. So yeah, it was confusing and it was awkward because I grew up really fast, Janet. I mean, practical example. I mean, I was basically cooking meals and doing laundry at 8 years old. I remember that because, not having a dad, my mom had to work. I'm the oldest. So I had to grow up real fast. And then my mom would tell me things that she wouldn't tell anybody else because I was the only stable factor in her life. Um, I had to learn to be an adult really fast. And like you, I'm sure there was a lot of confusing times in your life as there was in mine.
Hmm. Yeah, that is really difficult when you're taking on adult challenges, trying to comprehend all these things your mom is telling you and thinking, wonder why is she telling me this? Don't she have any
Right,
friends out there to go talk to about this type of thing? When you talk
right.
about growing up fast, you have how many siblings under you?
So I have a brother and then two sisters.
So do they all have the same father, or are they by
No,
multiple
yeah,
dads?
my brother, second father, my two sisters, a third father, and then the last dad. Now he had been married before, and he has. So I tell people, I don't have a family tree; I have a family orchard, right? Because my grandparents were married multiple times, all the dads were married multiple times. So I have these estranged brothers and sisters out there. Matter of fact, let's see, my third dad, I just found out that he had some siblings with his wife, another wife, and now we've connected via in social media. So I have these different people popping up that from these different dads, which probably is something similar to you, I would guess, just with all the things happened, right?
Yeah, it is. However, I didn't really care for it too much. And I don't know if you feel this way, but I look at my siblings as my half brothers and sisters. They say, well, we grew up with the same mom. I say, yeah, but we have different dads. I don't have the same dad you guys have. I look more like my dad's side of the family. So I look at them as half brothers and sisters. In reality, we are half brothers and sisters. They
Sure.
don't look at it that way. I always felt like it wasn't fair. I don't have a biological brother and sister. Wham, 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 wham. And I still feel that way today. Have you ever felt like that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I was actually thinking about this as we were in between when you'd asked me to do the podcast and now. It is so I have a brother and two sisters, as I mentioned. We grew up with the same mom. I realize it wasn't the same environment all the time because of different dads and all of
Mm-hmm.
that. But all of us have handled this totally differently.
Mm-hmm.
You asked the question, how have I handled it? I look at them as my brother and sisters, right? And I looked at each of my dads as my dad at the time, I guess. Um, but my brother and sisters didn't always handle it the same way. Later, my last dad, he adopted us. I was a ninth grader, and so we got my birth certificate changed to the last name that I am now, but my brother changed his name back to his dad when he turned 18. And listen, I'm not. That's not a judgmental statement. That's not. It's just who he is,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I respect that because everybody handles trauma, dysfunction differently.
Yes, we do. And it's really sad. Those of you that are listening, I'm talking with Pastor Rod regarding growing up in a family of multiple dads. And some of you out there might have multiple dads and you feel it's not fair and you're not sure where you came from. That's why people go to family trees and pay all this extra money to find out
Sure.
about your heritage. And that's something I wanted to do as well. You know, Pastor Rod, how did this experience with multiple fathers shape you in your family?
Yeah. That's a very interesting question because as I've gotten older, I've actually been able to look back and see the answer to that question, so to speak. Uh, I didn't have any dads that really helped me learn anything. And again, that's not a critical statement. I don't listen, everybody's broken, right? We're all broken. And so I don't have any bitterness or any unforgiveness or anything towards any of my family members. We're just broken people trying to figure life out. And but the reality was I didn't have anybody to really help me do anything. Don't remember ever playing catch with my dad. Don't know how to build anything or fix anything. So when I became a dad, I tried my best to do that with my kids because I knew what it was like not having that, and I didn't want to pass that legacy on, so to speak. And it's funny, Janet, because there'll be times when I'm talking with one of my kids, and I can tell that they've kind of zoned out a little bit, like, okay, I got it, right? And I've learned to say, okay, listen, I know I tell you a lot of things, I know I say a lot of things, but it's because I didn't have a dad. I try to make up for it. And so I end up giving you more advice than you probably want, but maybe it's because I didn't get any advice in life. I remember, Janet, the day before I was married, the day before I got married. And again, this is my fourth dad now, right? And I remember we were sitting out on the porch and I said, hey, Dad, is there any advice you want to give me before I get married? And he said, no, I think you got it figured out. And I was 21 years old, right? Um, and I just thought, I gave you an opportunity. I opened the door, and I would have loved for him just to say something, right? And again, there's no, not being, I'm not ugly toward that. But at the same time, I learned from that and I go, you know what? I want to be the kind of dad that is there for my kids all the time, and especially when they need it.
Mhm. You know, when most men grow up without fathers, they're bitter. They're
Yeah.
angry in the Black community. I know they're angry. A lot of fathers are in jail. More fathers are incarcerated than you can imagine, or they're alcoholics. And not that it's not in Hispanic or Caucasian or other families. I'm talking about the African American family growing up without
Yeah.
fathers. It's pretty prevalent in our culture. However, growing up without a dad, what experiences from these fathers that you got to know helped shape you into the man that you are today? Because you really didn't have a role model, did you?
Okay, so there's kind of two quick answers to that question. Number one, I didn't have a role model at home with dads, but I had several good role models outside the home. And like I lived in Phoenix, Arizona, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth grade, and I had a PE teacher named Mr. Nelson. And I was a pretty good athlete as a young kid, played all the sports, did all the activities, and he was always there. He always encouraged me. In junior high, I played basketball. We're in California, and Mr. Booth was my coach, and I was the captain of the team. And so he was always kind of aside. In high school, I had a swim coach in Nebraska, and so Mr. Brown, and I was the captain of the swim team my senior year. So I had these men in my life and it really fed into, like, maybe there's some value in my life, right? But really at home, Janet, I just didn't get that. But here's what I did learn from that. And I think this applies to any, like your boss, at work or whatever. There's certain things you like about your boss, and there's certain things maybe you don't like. And from that, you can learn who you want to be and who you don't want to be.
Mhm.
And so what I saw in my dad's was more of who I don't want to be, um, because I saw some of the ugly side of that, and I thought that's not who I want to be. So I had a dad who abandoned me. I don't want to abandon my family, right? I had a dad who was unfaithful. I don't want to be unfaithful.
When you think about your mom, having these multiple men in her life, did you look at your mom in a different way, even though she was mom? Like, why are you doing this? Or how can
Yeah.
you do this? Or another question I'm add on to that, was there something in her past, in her childhood, that put her on this trajectory to go
Yeah.
into multiple, or was there some type of trauma in her life? I know that was
Sure.
three questions.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's so my mom would tell me things that she wouldn't tell anybody else. And uh, she would tell me about some of the abuse she suffered as a kid. And I mean, I'm talking, Janet, about being put in a closet for a day or two, right? She had dentures at 28 years of age because her mom wouldn't let her brush her teeth. Um, just like severe abuse. And so knowing that, even though I saw all these other things in her life, I was very compassionate toward that, because so it didn't cause me to turn away. But I will say that there were a lot of days in our home where you walked on eggshells, because you didn't know who you were going to get that day. But I understood the background, and that helped me. It's the old adage of you really don't know someone until you walk in their shoes,
Right.
And I think I walked in my mom's shoes enough to know, okay, I know where she's coming from, and I don't like it, but she had a much worse past than I did.
When you know better, you do better. And I can relate to that because we were beat, even though my mom was abused by my stepfather who raised me, those beatings wind up turning into me getting those same type of beatings, butt naked with a broom handle and everything. And a lot of people say you went into homosexuality, you came out, aren't you angry with your mom? I had the best relationship with my mom for a very long time. Once she understood how I felt and going into homosexuality, my mom apologized. But I understood what she went through. And I couldn't hold my mom, those of you that are listening, you can't hold your parents accountable for what they don't know or what they
Sure.
did. They
Sure.
didn't have the kind of upbringing that we had. And so a lot of things that was done to us, what just how happens to be have been done to them. And they didn't get the counseling that we can get today and the help that we can get today. So I never held my mom responsible. Only thing I wanted was to be loved. I was the middle child. I just wanted a relationship with my mom. And those of you that are listening, some of you don't have a relationship with your parents because of what happened in your childhood. Give them some grace, just like you expect people to
Yeah.
give you, as Pastor Rod has given his mother grace for everything that he has been through. Pastor Rod, how did you navigate the emotional complexities of having four fathers?
Every day, right? I mean, here's the idea. We all face some aspect of dysfunction, right? And I don't know that anyone ever fully 100% gets to the place where they got it all figured out. Um, and so you hopefully get better each day, right? Whether you need to go and have sit down with a counselor or someone, or whether you need to just have a trusted friend just that's there for you, or in your own relationship with the Lord, where you just have that conversation with Him. So there are a lot of emotions. I remember my brother's grandmother. I would visit, my brother and I would go to Mississippi in the summers and visit grandma and grandpa and his dad and his new family, couple summers. And I remember, and I was like 6 and 7 years of age. And later in life, my family, my wife and kids, we were traveling through Mississippi to go to Florida. And we stopped at my grandmother's house. Well, I say my grandmother's, my brother's, and his grandfather had passed away, so it was just grandma. And my wife said to my brother's grandmother, "What do you remember most about Rod as a kid at 6 and 7 years old?" And without hesitation, it was like she knew the question was coming. She said, "Oh, he was very ornery." And then she said, "Well, what I mean by that is it would take him a long time to answer a question." And everybody, all my kids started laughing because whenever someone asked me a question, I would sit there and think about it for a long time. And I learned that, I think, from in my home. I didn't get physically abused, but there was a lot of verbal and a lot of nonverbal cues and manipulations and things of that nature that you had to learn to navigate as a small kid. And so whenever I would be asked a question, I had to think of every scenario in my head and play it out before I answered the question, because if I didn't answer it right, I was in trouble. Mm. And I think that was a huge thing that I had to learn later. And my wife helped me navigate through that it doesn't take, it's a simple question, just answer the question, you know. But for me, a lot of emotions went into a simple question. So hopefully I've gotten better, but again, you emotionally have to navigate life because of so much stuff in your past, right?
Yeah, trauma is hard to deal with. I was raped by one of those forefathers, my sister's dad, hanging out with her down at his house. He sent her and my little sister to the store, and he wound up raping me. 15 years later, I find out he did the same thing to my youngest sister. And we didn't even know about each other. And when I see physical abuse or I hear kids being raped, there's something in me that just, gets frustrated. And yes, you can heal inside, but you never forget.
Yeah.
Never forget the beatings. I never forget the names my mom called me. I never forget being raped. I just learned how to cope with those things.
Sure.
I've gotten older. And those of you that are listening, if you have a male friend that needs to hear this message, whether you're on YouTube or on my podcast, please send this to them, because I believe our men are the head of the home, but also I believe that a lot of them need to be healed from the inside out. And it's really hard for them to admit that they need help. And I'm hoping that Pastor Rod's story will impact you to get the help that you so desperately need, so you can be a great father, you can be a great spouse, you can be a great leader, because we need our men to step up and take their place as the leaders that God has called them to be. Pastor Rod, how do you think your upbringing has affected your ministry, if it has at all?
Yeah. Again, because I've had some good role models, I started going to a youth group when I was 17 years of age. And I had some good, strong other young men my age that really poured into my life. And it's interesting, Janet, my first youth pastor, and really my first spiritual mentor of any kind, was a woman. Mm-hmm. A woman youth pastor. And this is back in the late 70s, when there weren't many youth pastors who were women, right? And but looking back on that, Janet, I think I would have had a hard time with a male youth pastor at that. I don't know that I would have fully trusted them because of the way I grew up, right? But having a female youth pastor, I think, allowed me, because I had a good relationship with my mom. We were real close because of things we've mentioned before. But so between that and between these young men my age, and then they started speaking, hey, I believe that God's called you to ministry. In other words, it was some people speaking into my life, because I didn't know the church lingo. I didn't know how the rules worked, any of that stuff. I mean, we didn't go to church on Easter when I grew up. So all of a sudden, all these things are coming at me. And so long story short is, I was going to school at the university studying engineering. I was going into ROTC in the Air Force. My dad was in the Air Force, my last dad. But they kept speaking that into me. And so anyway, I started pursuing ministry credentials. And the thing is, Janet, over the years, I did youth ministry for a long time. A lot of youth camps, a lot of youth, everything, right? I was able to tell that story about four dads. And what's interesting is that when I first started telling it, kids would come up to me and they'd say, "Oh man, I feel so bad for you, because that's a lot," right? I tell that story in the last 5 years, 10 years, and kids come up to me and go, "I've had five dads," or "I was born in prison," and I'm like, it's changed. I mean, what used to be, I feel sorry for you or I feel bad for you has become, I can outdo you. And I don't mean that, the way it sounds,
Yeah.
but, you know, and so it's shown me the need, like you said earlier, for a strong father in the home.
Mhm.
And a year or so ago, I was working in a foster care ministry for 5 years. I worked in a foster care ministry, and I saw the ramifications of not having that strong dad in the home. And as you mentioned before, prison, sex trafficking, homelessness, poverty. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, where you just don't have that dad. And here's the thing: when I tell the story, like I did at Foundations Church, uh, I this is not to take anything away from a woman, right? A mom. Um, you know, the first two words that God said to the woman were, "You're going to be a suitable helpmate. You're going to help." And my wife has been incredible in my life and helped me walk through that, right? But the calling has allowed me to really focus on who God is as a father, because He's the only father that has stayed with me the entire time, even when I didn't know Him.
That is powerful. I have two questions. One, do you ever have a desire to find your biological father, or do you know where he is? And I struggle with this with God because I really didn't have a dad. And once I found out who my real father was, I was so confused. It was like
Sure.
none of these men. It's like I pulled away, and my stepfather who was raising me said, "Well, as I got older, well, you're the one that pulled away. Well, you're supposed to be the dad. You're the one
Right.
who's supposed to embrace me." But again, you don't know what you don't know. And so when it's time to relate to God, and I'm not kidding, just this week, I was walking around praying, and I said, "God, who are you?" You said you're my father. You're not tangible. I can't touch you. I can't feel you. All my friends are married. I feel alone. I mean, you're a father to the fatherless. It doesn't make sense to me.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And I'm 66 years old, and I can't imagine, people that are out there listening to this, whether you're male or female, just thinking the same way I'm thinking. But can you speak into those two questions?
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because, people all the time, whenever and I've shared that story multiple times, the four fathers, right? And people would come up to me and they'd say, "You ever try to find your dad? Or why don't you try to find your dad? Or do you know who your dad is?" And my response, Janet, was, "You know what? This is just who I am. Everybody's different, right?" I just said, "Listen, here's the deal. He's probably married. He's probably got kids. I don't want to be that guy that walks into his life and disrupts another family."
Right.
Right? Now that's just me. I mean, somebody else, but my second daughter, she would always ask me, she said, "Dad, why don't you find your dad? Why don't you find your dad? Why don't you find?" And I'm like, "Why is it so important to you?" She said, "Well, because he's my grandpa." And I never thought of it that way, right? So I said to her, I said, "Listen, hon, if you want to search, you have my blessing," right? And so again, a lot more details than we have time for, but she found, so he has passed away. He passed away well, it's been now 4, 5, 6 years ago. But she found my half brother. So he got married and had a son and a daughter.
Wow.
And she called him. And of course, you can imagine getting that phone call like, "Who in the world are you with all the scams and things going on today?" Like, you're my dad's half brother. What are you talking about? And anyway, so come to find out, they had both taken one of those DNA tests, right? And he asked me, he said, "Have you taken that?" She goes, "Yeah, I have." "What was the result?" She goes, "Well, I never looked." She opened it up. They were a 95% match.
Wow.
They were the strongest match on both,
Wow.
right? And so he said, "Okay, maybe this is legit," right? He goes and tells his uncle. So, like, "Hey, your brother, my dad, this happened." The uncle goes into the house, comes back out with a letter and it shows that my bio dad had written to his brother, saying, "Hey, here's what's happened," and the whole story about the $5 bet and all of that. And so now my half brother, so we've had some limited contact. We, through social media and through an email, and he sent me some pictures and some update on health issues and things like that. And I've sent some pictures. We haven't contacted each other. I don't know that we ever will. I mean, when I say contact, I mean physically. Maybe that'll happen one day. Yeah. So, and I saw a picture of my dad presently, or, right before he died. So that's been kind of an interesting journey in and of itself.
Yeah, that I think I commend your daughter for doing that, because if something comes up health wise and you needed to have that information,
yeah,
you would have it. And I just think that is so important. What message do you hope to convey to others who might relate to your story? I want to give you the last word.
Yeah, thank you. Again, all of us experience some level of dysfunction, right? And my story, I tell people this when I share it. I say, listen, I'm not here to compare war stories, because all of us have fought wars in our family and in life, right? And as I listen to you and your story, I go, okay, I did not experience half of what you did in your background. So I realize there's a lot of people out there that would say, I'll trade stories with you, right? So my point is not to make people feel sorry or anything like that. My whole point is I've learned to lean on my Father in heaven, right? I've learned to trust him, and I've learned to develop relationship with him in a way that maybe, and you never know, but if I'd had a good dad, I don't know. Maybe I wouldn't have leaned on my Father in heaven as much. And so I would just lovingly encourage people listening, whatever your background, whatever trauma situation you've been through, to embrace the one who loves you more than anybody else. Jeremiah, I think it's 3:19, and God's talking through the prophet Jeremiah to Israel. And he's saying, I so wanted you to call me Father. And I think, wow, I mean, so wanted you to call me Father, which implies a whole different relationship rather than, hey, God, can you do this for me? Mm-hmm. So I would say, learn to trust your Father. And then second, as best you can, and I realize for some it's more difficult than others, don't allow bitterness and unforgiveness to remain a part of who you are, because that's not who you are. And don't be trapped by those feelings and emotions, but rather learn to be able to forgive, move past the bitterness. I know it's easier said than done, but because you really don't experience who you really are until you can move beyond those emotions. Mm-hmm. So that would be the message.
It most definitely is a process of healing.
It is.
Those of you that are listening, Healing and Made Free, you're talking with Pastor Rod, who grew up with multiple fathers and actually was born out of a bet that his mother and father would sleep together at the end of the night. And that happened and he was born. But you know what? When it all said and done, God already knew before the foundation of the earth that you and I were going to have this conversation, that you were going to be born, that you were going to go through the process that you have went through. I hope those of you that are listening, male or female, if you know somebody that is struggling in this particular area, having multiple dads, please share this podcast with them or YouTube channel with them. Pastor Rod, you are a blessing. Thank you so much for being on Healing and Made Free with Janet Boynes.
Thank you, Jan. It's been a pleasure, and blessings on all those who are listening to my story. I appreciate that.
Thank you for listening to Healing and Made Free with Janet Boynes. Acts 10:34 says, God is no respecter of persons. God doesn't play favorites, which means what he has done for Janet, what he has done for guests on this show, he will do for you too. If you are struggling with anything, do not hesitate to reach out to Janet Boynes Ministries. They will do their best to help you any way they can. Go to the website, janetboynesministries.com. Janet loves you, and most importantly, God loves you. Have a blessed day.